Welcome, everyone. I'm Dave Feldman, Director of Water UCI. We're just going to give it a few moments for people to check into the webinar, and we'll begin shortly. All right, I think we can begin. Well, once again, I'm Dave Feldman. I'm the Director of Water UCI. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our second Water UCI Colloquium of the 2021 academic year. Our host this afternoon is Nancy Vogel, who's the Director of Governor Gavin Newsom's Water Portfolio Program, California Natural Resources Agency. And Nancy is going to provide an overview of the California Water Resilience Portfolio. Following Nancy's talk, there'll be a series of questions that I'll share with her. And then we'll devote the remaining time to questions that you might have. You may use the Q&A function on the webinar screen to submit questions. We will also provide a link to the California Water Resilience Portfolio that has been released, I believe, in July. So you'll have an opportunity to refer to that in the future. And I should also add that this presentation this afternoon will be recorded as well. So just a couple of announcements. We're going to have some future events which we'll share with you down the road. Keep your eyes open for a colloquium on PFAS, also on water marketing and other topics later this year. I want to take this opportunity to thank Han Parker and Naveen Samy from the School of Social Ecology for their assistance in planning and publicizing these events. And I especially want to thank Shannon Roback, who is the Associate Director of Water UCI and pivotal in organizing these events. So I want to introduce Nancy Vogel. Nancy joined the Natural Resources Agency as Director of the Governor's Water Portfolio Program in May of 2019. She helped prepare and now coordinates implementation of the Water Resilience Portfolio and assists with other water policy priorities. Prior to her appointment, Nancy had been Director of Communications at the Resources Legacy Fund. She was Deputy Secretary for Communications at the California Natural Resources Agency before that, and Assistant Director for Communications at the Department of Water Resources. Nancy has also served as a Principal Consultant for the Senate Office of Oversight and Outcomes. That was back between 2008 and 2012, and a staff writer for the LA Times from 2000 to 2008 and the Sacramento Bee from 1991 to 2000. Last but not least, Nancy served as a member of the Klamath River Renewal Corporation Board of Directors. That was in 2018. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in Conservation and Resource Studies and a Master of Arts in Journalism, both from the University of California at Berkeley. Nancy, welcome. Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Director Feldman. I appreciate that. And you too, Associate Director Shannon Roback. I really appreciate you guys having me here. It's always good to get the chance to communicate with folks in Southern California. It's a lot easier now that I don't have to catch a Southwest flight to do that. It saves a lot of time. So I'm going to share my screen and click through a PowerPoint presentation, and then I look forward to your questions. I'm going to tell you how we developed the portfolio and give you some basic understanding of it, and you can ask me how we're going to make it all happen. Let me see if I do. All right, here we go. So this all started with the governor's executive order back in April of 2019, and then I was hired in May 2019 to carry it out, and I've been running hard ever since. And the governor's executive order was pretty clear, explicit about what we needed to do. He directed us being the Natural Resources Agency, the California Environmental Protection Agency, and the California Department of Food and Agriculture to work together to craft a portfolio with a regional perspective and focus on partnerships and coordination, innovation, integration across state government, etc. We are to craft a suite of actions that together would help address longstanding water challenges while positioning the state and its diverse regions to cope with a changing climate. So as you know, we're already experiencing climate change. August was the hottest August on record in California, and average higher temperatures mean that our precipitation patterns are changing. The wets are wetter and the dries are drier. All of this is happening while our infrastructure is aging, and we can expect to add another 5 million people in California by 2050. So there was a good reason to step back and ask on the governor's behalf to take a look at our water policy. He did ask us to emphasize certain principles. I don't know if they all fit in the definition of principle, but to do things in the actions of the portfolio, which is to work across governments and to look for innovation, try to find models that worked elsewhere. And there was a big emphasis in the portfolio on the use of natural infrastructure, our meadows, our forests, our floodplains, our streams. So we held quite a bit of outreach to stakeholders, and we did an inventory and an assessment of various aspects of California water as was dictated in the executive order. And we released a draft portfolio in January 2020, and it included a list of 133 actions that state agencies should take. These were not directives to local water districts. These were actions that state agencies should take in order to support local systems and resilience. We got a huge amount of feedback on the draft, including more than 200 letters containing very substantial comments and hundreds of specific edits and recommendations. Overall, I would say that the stakeholders embraced the principles behind the portfolio, and everyone found something to like and something to dislike in it. That's classic California water. So at the highest level now, the final portfolio that we released in July includes 142 separate actions. So that's up from 133. It grew. We added 14 new actions and we deleted 5, and we tried to adjust specific actions in the final version that had elicited strong, well-reasoned arguments from stakeholders, criticisms. For example, we had in the draft, we had an action that would have directed water users to provide real-time data about their water diversions. And that has been modified to say, look, state government, go look at the costs and the benefits of doing so before we impose such a mandate. Is it worth it? Most of the new actions in the final version focus on the health of forested upper watersheds, tribal issues and leadership, and coordinating at the California-Mexico border to reduce water pollution. There are other additional actions that are related to, for example, getting tax-exempt status for water conservation-related rebates, evaluating proposals to make water conservation, urban stream restoration, and supporting salinity and brine management. So I would say that most of the 5 actions that we cut were related to the incredibly swift economic downturn we suffered between January, but the way things changed between January when we released the draft and July after COVID when we released the final. Now, the actual actions within the portfolio take up only a few pages, but it's a substantial document, and it has big appendices that if you get a chance to look at the document, I urge you to look at the appendices, because we took a look, as the governor directed in his executive order, at each of the regions, 10 hydrologic regions in California. And we pulled information together from across state agencies related to water supply and demand, potential impacts of climate change, and water quality, water rights. The appendices include snapshots of each region in terms of where the water comes from, how it is used, what its major water quality concerns are, in-stream flow requirements where they exist. Those are legal requirements to maintain certain flows for the sake of fish and wildlife. That doesn't exist on many streams in California. And then also likely climate change effects. We used a lot of different sources of information in addition to do something that was kind of out there for a state agency. We informally ranked each region in terms of vulnerabilities. We had a dozen different vulnerabilities that we looked at, including exposure to flood and drought risk, water affordability, and sea level rise. And it was interesting to pull all that information, various databases together to kind of spitball vulnerability for each region on a scale of 1 to 4. And of course, this was nothing that had any academic rigor to it, nothing that could possibly have been peer reviewed. It wasn't scientific. Our aim was simply to stimulate the conversation about how to achieve water resilience in California with its incredible geographic diversity. So some of the common themes that you'll find in the portfolio are that managing water in California is primarily the work of local water districts, counties, and cities, and that we believe the best approaches rise from locals with state support that's agile enough to address regional variation. Connections build strength is another theme. California is a system of systems when it comes to water. It works best with well-placed, well-functioning connections, whether those are digital or human or physical. Another theme is that preparation pays off, and the 2012 to 2016 drought showed that. The big urban water districts in California did a better job of anticipating and blunting that crisis than did small districts or those who are managing for fish and wildlife. Climate change, it makes advanced planning for everybody all that much more critical. The final portfolio, as I said, has 142 actions, and they all fall within 4 major rubrics: maintain and diversify water supplies, protect and enhance natural systems, build connections, and be prepared. Now, we realize that we cannot tackle all 142 separate actions at the state government in the document with equal vigor, given our limited resources. You might recall that the state budget went from a $6 billion surplus in January to a $54 billion deficit by July. When we issued the draft portfolio in January, the administration was working on crafting a climate resilient bond, $4.75 billion climate bond, 60% of which would have gone to water and would have really helped carry out a lot of the actions in the portfolio. Of course, there is no such bond on the November ballot because of the economic downturn, and general fund resources at the state have been tightened considerably. So with a dramatically curtailed budget and bond resources, the portfolio by necessity is an aspirational document. But we do have existing bond funds and general funds that will allow us to make progress on many of these actions in coming years. And what I'm going to highlight are 11 priority actions that the governor and our secretaries of our 3 agencies highlighted when they released the final portfolio in July. The first one is to implement the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Act. You might recall that the governor signed this law in July 2019. This summer, the Water Board approved the 2020 to 2021 expenditure plan that prioritizes up to $130 million to numerous projects. The goal here is to, I think that the governor called it a moral shame that we have an estimated 1 million Californians who do not have access in their homes or their workplaces or their schools to safe and affordable drinking water. So the funds will help address community and school water systems that are out of compliance with health standards, assist disadvantaged communities, tackle contaminated private wells and small water systems, and accelerate the consolidations for water systems that are at risk of failing to provide safe drinking water. There's a 19-member advisory group that has helped the State Water Resources Control Board prepare a needs analysis and establish the priorities for spending this money. My hope is that we can make a lot of progress with this money before the next drought comes and we see domestic wells going dry again or small water systems going dry. Another priority is obviously the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which was a package of 3 laws that were enacted by the legislature and the governor in 2014 to, over the course of decades, have local governments bring overdrafted water basins, groundwater basins, into sustainable conditions. Now, the sustainability plans have been submitted for most overdrawn groundwater basins under the implementation of this law. 260 new groundwater sustainability agencies have been created around California, most of them where the overdrawn basins are, which is the San Joaquin Valley, the Central Coast, and the Sacramento Valley. Now, it's up under the law, it's now up to the Department of Water Resources and the State Water Resources Control Board to review these initial plans from the locals for adequacy, and decisions are expected on the adequacy of these plans within the next 2 years. But the action that we included in the portfolio is to create an interagency, state interagency Sigma support team that goes beyond simply carrying out the law. What we're trying to do is step out of our roles as regulators and identify where there are state technical and other kinds of support that we could pull together to support the regions as they try to bring their groundwater basins into sustainable conditions. And that team is going to include, for example, GoBiz, the governor's economic development arm, and the Labor and Workforce Development Agency. And it's going to help on, hopefully we're going to focus on helping local governments facilitate recharge, engage disadvantaged communities, and then try to support county planners as they have to start looking around the curve at the changes that are going to come in land use as land is fallowed, and what that means for tax bases and job roles and zoning. Now, the next priority is achieving voluntary agreements. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the importance of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which drains nearly 50% of the land mass of California out through the Delta into San Francisco Bay. The State Water Resources Control Board by law must regulate the beneficial uses of water in the Delta. And that's tricky because 2/3 of California's population depends on water exported from the Delta for their drinking water supply, and 3 million acres of farmland are irrigated with water from the Delta. So the state launched a framework in February that described what is needed to meet the legal requirements of a water quality control plan in the Delta. Our hope was to try to take a voluntary, more flexible, but legally binding and durable approach to meeting water quality standards in the Delta that would encourage water districts to invest in habitat restoration and spawning gravel, easing of fish passage and so on, and also additional or changes in the timing and patterns of flows to better help salmon and steelhead and other native fish. Our goal here is to try to find flexible ways beyond regulation to meet the legal standards to protect water quality and fish and wildlife. And those negotiations got complicated over recent litigation over endangered species protections in the Delta, but we are still committed to trying to achieve these voluntary agreements, at least at the Natural Resources Agency and Cal EPA. This is important to Southern California. Another priority is to update regulations to expand water recycling. The city of Los Angeles, for example, has committed to recycling all of its wastewater by 2035 to support LA and to support every other city or water district that is looking to expand water recycling. The state needs to adopt new regulations that would allow cities to skip the step of putting treated wastewater into aquifers or reservoirs to mix with other sources before being put into distribution systems. We're hopeful that we can get these new regulations in place by 2023. They have to come from the State Water Resources Control Board, and they involve an expert panel. A great deal of money has come, I'm thinking about the Integrated Regional Water Management Program and the money that they have made available for water recycling. And how important that is. These regulations, I think, will help drought-proof Southern California to an even greater degree. The California Department of Food and Agriculture was pleased to see this highlighted as a priority by the governor. Agriculture covers 25% of California's land mass and uses 80% of its developed water. We support voluntary efforts by growers and ranchers to build their soil health, which not only improves it as an asset for them, but also allows for more retention of water and sequestration of carbon, and may even have some biodiversity benefits in terms of pollinators. Now, there's plenty of opportunity up in the Sacramento Valley to give rivers more room to roam and to enjoy many ancillary benefits from that, including reduced peak flows in the river channel in the winter storms and the replenishment of aquifers, creation of new habitat, and the nourishing of soils. So funds from previous bonds will allow us to help support more floodplain restoration. Now, when voters passed Proposition 1 in 2014, that was a water bond. It included $2.7 billion to pay for the public benefits of new water storage projects. And those benefits, they could be environmental, or they could be related to water quality or flood control or emergency response or recreation. In July 2018, the Water Commission, which was charged with spending the $2.7 billion in a responsible manner, the Water Commission selected 8 projects. Half of them are surface storage involving either a new or an expanded dam. Half of them are groundwater projects. And the Water Commission hasn't funded anybody yet. We are now in the stage where the project proponents of these 8 projects have got to meet certain milestones, such as feasibility studies and environmental studies and funding arrangements. And there's a January 2022 deadline that they need to hit. And then the Water Commissions can start to take that public money to support these projects so that we all ideally get the public benefits from them. So state agencies are working hard with the project proponents to calculate and then contract for those public benefits. It's a new way to look at water storage, and it's been tricky, but so far we're on track. So if you're familiar with the Delta, you know that the diversion point for the State Water Project is in the Delta, and you know that it's vulnerable to disruption by levee failure, rising sea levels, and changing precipitation patterns. So the Department of Water Resources is in the midst of environmental studies on a project that would build additional State Water Project intakes in the northern Delta. Right now, those points are in the southern Delta and fairly close to the salty tides that come in from San Francisco Bay. We're looking at moving the diversion points to the north and connecting those diversion points to the existing pumping plants in the South Delta with an underground tunnel about 30 miles long. The Salton Sea in Imperial and Riverside counties is shrinking. It's an increasingly saline inland lake, and it's leaving behind a dry lake bed that can become hazard. The particulates are hazardous when they become airborne. The Natural Resources Agency, the Department of Water Resources, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife are working to carry out a 10-year plan that aims to improve conditions at the sea by constructing 30,000 acres of habitat and dust suppression projects around the perimeter. So the Klamath River is the second largest river in California, and it was once a major producer of salmon on the West Coast. There are 4 dams that serve almost no function in terms of water supply or flood control. They do produce a minor amount of hydroelectricity. They're owned by the Pacific Corp, which is a utility based out of Portland. And these 4 dams, they block some 300 miles of excellent spawning habitat for salmon. So the state of California and the state of Oregon are working with Pacific Corp to transfer ownership of these obsolete dams to a nonprofit, the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, that would take ownership of the dams for the sole purpose of removing them. And this is as far as I know, it is the biggest river restoration effort anywhere. And the dam removal is a crucial step to reviving the salmon runs that the Klamath and the Hoopa and the Karuk and the Yurok people all depend upon physically, culturally, and spiritually. At a more broad level, this cuts across so many actions in our portfolio. We all know that a common, readily available set of facts can make balancing our competing needs less contentious and more efficient. The portfolio includes actions to modernize water data systems to inform real-time water management and long-term planning. And it also puts an onus on state government to streamline data submission where possible and to align water diversion reporting to a single date in the hope that that will save water users some hassle and some money. So those were the 11 priorities that we're determined to make progress on in the next couple of years. And what happens if we succeed, right? I know that, Dave, I think you're going to want to address that. And I was just thinking, I went to my happy place earlier today and I thought, okay, what if we can actually carry out most of the actions in the portfolio? What would it look like? And here are just some thoughts that I had. Over the next 10 to 20 years, if we succeed, we would expect to see water districts and state agencies and groundwater sustainability agencies using common terminology and consistent water accounting methods so that it's easier for them to plan for water supply and to plan for environmental flows that would help integrate how they can match their assets and their challenges across the watershed and help one another get through drought and flood. We hopefully will have water managers who have developed scientifically defensible flow recommendations that balance human and ecological needs for water, which means we won't have to have hundreds of fish rescues in the next drought because we will have already determined what the flows ought to be. And maybe we will have struck voluntary agreements with water users to supply those flows. We will have anticipated and made contingency plans for fish and wildlife, just like we do for humans for the next drought. And some other thoughts. We would have new updated regulations in place that encourage developers in cities and water districts to install water efficient landscapes and appliances and to recycle and reuse water on site and at a larger scale. And when we have the next drought, we would have a far diminished number of domestic wells going dry and no small water systems would be disrupted because we would have already connected or consolidated or provided for them in some way. We would see water districts investing in the health of upper watershed forests. We would have modernized our water grid, that network of rivers and streams and channels and canals and aqueducts. We will have modernized it so that as precipitation patterns change, we can capture water when it's available and sink it underground or store it in reservoirs and trade it more easily when the dry times come. We'd have a whole new diverse generation of leaders running water districts and state agencies. We would have obsolete dams that are gone, and we'd have far more free-flowing streams and hundreds of miles more of good spawning habitat. We would have some new bypasses or other kind of flood infrastructure in place to handle the much bigger peak flows that we expect on places like the lower San Joaquin River, which is really the kind of thing that keeps people awake at night when you think about it. And we would have water right regulators who have a much better sense of who's using water, when, and how. And California would be speaking with one strong voice to the federal government about what we need in terms of science and money and support. So I will stop there and answer any of your questions. I know you got some, Dave. We can start there.
Nancy, thank you. That was great. Really illuminating and broad-based and really well covered. And indeed, one of the questions that I signaled that I know our audience would be concerned about, I think you did a great job of addressing and laying out some of these future aspirations, what would change. And I really appreciate that, and I know the audience does as well. I do have a couple questions, and before I turn to audience questions, let me start with a question that you also began to answer, but I would like your reflections on this, since I know you've been working in this field for a while in different capacities. As you well know, there have been numerous efforts over the past few years to better plan for California's water future. Updates on the California state water plans, for instance, produced by the State Water Resources Control Board. I know you've touched on this, but what do you think are some of the distinctive or unique characteristics of the water resilience portfolio as opposed to these previous efforts? What sorts of things do you see as unique and distinctive?
That's a good question, Dave. Those of you who've been around in the water world for a while probably remember Governor Brown's Water Action Plan. I almost said portfolio. The Water Action Plan, right. And that came out in 2014 and that was updated in 2016. And it was a good, solid, succinct plan. And we didn't scrap that at all. We're trying with our portfolio to build upon that. And you'll see a whole lot in Governor Brown's water action plan that we're trying to carry through in the portfolio. A big difference, I think, is the water action plan was essentially drafted by bureaucrats at the state level and then thrown out for a few weeks for public comment and then revised. The water resilience portfolio that we worked on was pretty maddening, I think, to stakeholders, because we pretty much just for months said, give us your ideas. What do you think should be in a water resilience portfolio at the state level? What should the state be focusing on? It would have been easier, I think, for people to have a document to react to. But I have to say that initial round of gathering public input, we had some 20 public listening sessions held around the state, and I met one-on-one with dozens and dozens and dozens of stakeholders in different groups. That was a privilege to learn so much, and I think it helped shape the portfolio to a great degree. You didn't see that in Governor Brown's water action plan. So I think stakeholder input helped shape this document, and then the appendices that are fairly substantial in our portfolio are something you did not see. You generally don't see in other high-level water policy documents. And those appendices, that regional snapshot, that sense of where are we in terms of California's water supply and demand, that came from the governor's executive order. He asked us, step back, do an inventory, do an assessment, and then take a look at what we need.
Bottom up rather than top down.
Right.
Yeah, very good, very good. I did want to take at this point a question that one of our audience participants submitted. The question first begins with a statement: glad to hear that hindrances to salmon are being addressed. I assume this is referring at least in part to the Klamath River dam removal proposal. Glad to hear hindrances to salmon are being addressed. What degree of success for salmon can we look forward to, and over what time period do you think?
I'm optimistic. I focused mostly in my presentation on the 4 dams on the Klamath River, and of course, gaining 300 new miles of, regaining 300 miles of spawning habitat there would be substantial, and that would help the whole, besides the tribal nations, it would help the commercial and recreational fisheries on the West Coast. But the floodplain projects that we're working on in the Sacramento Valley, I think will really help salmon quite a bit. We're working on fish passage problems in the Sacramento Valley as well. We saw it in the 2012 to 2016 drought that winter run Chinook salmon, which they evolved to spawn well beyond what is now Shasta Lake. And so they are blocked from the cold water habitat where they typically would spawn, and they're left to spawn just below Shasta Dam where the water gets too warm too often. So they really suffered in the 2012 to 2016 drought because we had some water temperature management problems at Shasta Dam. So the federal biological agencies have worked on creating, essentially reintroducing winter run Chinook salmon to Battle Creek, which is a beautiful stream that drains to the upper Sacramento River. And so far, the news we're getting is that the salmon are taking hold there. And so that's a way to help cope with climate change, right? To, increase the number of populations you have of this endangered species so that, one bad event doesn't wipe them out completely. I'm optimistic that we'll continue to invest in floodplain. The floodplain projects help salmon in that when we return water to the land and it gets to spread out like it used to, the Central Valley was once an inland sea every winter, and that made for rich food production for salmon. And if we can start to do more of that, we can boost the food supply in the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River and all the tributaries. And that will help salmon. As it is right now, we have a system where, young salmon, their best bet is to just shoot right through the valley and get out of the delta and get out to the ocean because there are so many hazards on the way. But the scientists tell us that the bigger and stronger those young salmon are when they hit the Pacific Ocean, the more likely they are to return. So we need to make the valley and all the tributaries coming out of the Sierra better places for salmon. I'm optimistic. It's a big priority of this agency.
Great, great. Thank you for that. We have another couple questions from the audience, really good questions. It's interesting, we had a colloquium on COVID-19 last week, but this question sort of ties the two together. Does the portfolio now consider including the effects of COVID-19 in water sources, drinking water, wastewater, any addressing of that issue?
That is a great question. And no, I don't know that we're going to go back and revise the portfolio, but I got to tell you, I've been thinking along the same lines, and it's clear to me, if I could go back in time, we'd spend a lot more time in as we could develop the portfolio on affordability and equity and the financial constraints on local water districts. The pandemic has really brought that to bear, and attention's gonna need to be paid. I fear, right now you've got local water districts that are continuing to provide water to customers who can't afford to pay their bills, and that is as it should be. But the bill will come due at some point for the local water districts or the individual customers. And I fear that we will not be able to, the local water districts won't be able to make the investments in infrastructure and planning that they had anticipated because their reserves are shrinking and there's a more immediate crisis for them to deal with.
So a lot of long-term impacts that we've never really foreseen from this.
That's right.
Great point.
And I think the state just has to stay poised to figure out how we can best help.
Right. So as we know, and as you alluded to, Nancy, in your talk on the water resilience portfolio, we've certainly had a history of droughts in California. Whenever the next big drought comes, how prepared do you think California is now for another drought, major drought?
We've been talking a lot about that because we haven't seen any rain up here. It's October now, almost November. I'm worried. And last year was a below normal year for precipitation in Northern California, where it really counts. And not to slight you Southern Californians, but you had in some places in Southern California above average precipitation, but that's not obviously where most of the water comes from that supplies the state. So we are beginning to, drought is a well-worn path in California. We know where we're going to start to see problems. It'll be the fractured the wells on fractured groundwater in the Sierra Nevada and on the Central Coast. And then it's a slow-moving natural disaster. So it unfolds slowly, and we kind of know where the problems will be. And I'm hoping that the many actions that were taken during and after the 2012 to 2016 drought will help us head off many of those problems again. But as I said, when I talked about the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Act implementation, we've just begun that, right? We really need 10 years of work with that $130 million a year to correct most of the problems. So we're still going to have problems if next year is dry and the year after that is dry. I'm worried too about fish and wildlife. We need to start preparing contingency plans and voluntary agreements for dry years that help make sure we don't see slack, flows that are so slack and so warm that we're endangering species. And I think we're behind the curve on that. And we've got meetings coming up to talk about this. If the winter continues to stay dry, what do we need? One thing that could be done is that I think in the last drought, it was clear that when the emergency finally settled on everyone and the state began to make resources available to local water districts, a lot of those local water districts didn't have projects that were ready to go to spend that money to fix those problems. So one thing the state could do is at the end of a second dry winter, maybe signal, look folks, if we get a third dry winter, there will be funding available to help you. So start planning now for what you think you need. So those are the kinds of actions that we need to do.
Great. Yeah, foresight. So we have a couple of really interesting questions. I'm going to start with this one, close to the heart of some of us who are in the social sciences. Can you reflect on what contributions are needed from the social sciences in these initiatives?
Oh,
Students,
everything.
faculty, yeah. Have at it, Nancy.
Oh, yeah. So many of these problems are not technical, not even financial. They are, they are problems of human communication and connection and education. I find it interesting that your institute is based out of what do you call it, social ecology department? And that's as it should be. In the course of helping to develop the portfolio and now to implement it, I'm finding these amazing things happening that one would think would happen on their own, but tend not to unless someone focuses on them. I get a group of people from the State Water Resources Control Board. I get another group from the Department of Water Resources, 2 different programs they're managing. I bring them together and I say, this is our shared problem. And wow, it's incredible how the discussions take off and the ideas flow and respect is built for one another's perspective. And that shouldn't be happenstance. We have to somehow find ways to make these connections a key part of what we do. And anyway, I'm learning as I go. I need there's so much we need from the sociologists. Meeting people where they are, like fostering a respect for other perspectives and sense of place. Anyway, we should talk more.
We definitely will, and really appreciate your answer, as I know the audience does. And of course, all of the issues you mentioned have social and political dimensions. So, and
Yeah,
dimension.
right. And we don't often build when we talk about these water problems. We're always looking for some technical fix, and we don't often build into it. We don't bring people along. We don't share the problems so that people can understand them and then share the potential solutions. We just say, here, this is what we think ought to be done. And then we get mad when people don't embrace it.
Great.
You all know that.
Yep. So we have a really wonderful question on groundwater recharge. And of course, one of the points that you made in your presentation was how the state could help on implementation of SGMA. Let me simply read the question. What details can you share regarding planning and development of groundwater recharge facilities for California? Orange County has 1,000 acres devoted to recharge from the Santa Ana River. Based on a review of daily flows, it looks like Orange County Water District needs at least another 500 acres at a cost of probably $1 billion. State grants, guidance would be helpful for Orange County, and the rest of the state would appreciate it also. Your reaction, your thoughts?
No, we get it. And the climate resilience bond that never came to be on the November ballot would have helped, provide more funding for grants for projects like recharge. But another way that I think the state can help is, let's face it, most water infrastructure in California is built, paid for, and managed by local districts. Well, to make those investments in recharge, you need to know what kind of supplies you can anticipate with climate change. And I think that's where the state can provide a service in doing, and this is a key part of the portfolio, the state can provide watershed scale climate vulnerability analyses that look at what can you expect in terms of flows as climate, under various scenarios. And then, from that, you can start to build out an adaptation plan. But I think consistent and uniform and comprehensive information from the state on a watershed scale would help a lot of districts, and that would include with recharge projects.
Excellent. One of the questions I had before we go back to the audience, and again, you've partly addressed this, Nancy, but I'm curious, you mentioned the public feedback that you received on the draft of the portfolio between roughly January and July. And I know it was extensive. Could you highlight some of the specific revisions that came out of that feedback, particularly in regards to things like tribal interests and tribal leadership, the health of upper watersheds, and cross-boundary water issues?
Absolutely. Before I do that, I want to just make the point that as we developed the portfolio, there was a constant tension between our ambitions and the reality check that was provided by the State Department of Finance. Because, you know, they are the people who track the money, and they wanted to make sure that we did not get beyond, they wanted to make sure that we don't include actions in the portfolio that we cannot afford as a state. And they were, you know, I grumbled and complained, you know, at that constant check on our ambitions. But when I look back at the downturn we faced after the draft came out, the Department of Finance was correct in telling us, hold on, can you really do this? Can you do this with existing funds? And so the new actions that were added to the portfolio, to get to your question, Dave, you might look at them and say, oh, come on, you guys were doing that already, right? And there are many actions that the state was already carrying out, but it was important, we felt, to highlight that as part of the portfolio approach and to make that simply, you know, by dint of it being in the portfolio, a state priority. So, but then on the tribal issues, it became clear to us from the stakeholder comments that, you know, we didn't have anything in there that talked about traditional ecological knowledge, and there should have been something in there. And the governor, it reinforced the need for us to find a way to incorporate Native understanding into our resource management with his recent October 7th executive order that had to do with biodiversity and climate change and natural and working lands. And and I'm going to make a plug here for on November 13th. If you go to resources.ca.gov, you'll see there's information. We're going to have a speaker series on Friday, November 13th from 12:30 to 1:45, where we're looking at what does true co-management mean in terms of our California Native tribes. You know, we know that there are structural changes that could be made to reintegrate Native people and their knowledge into the way we manage resources. So that was one thing that we added and we're working on in the portfolio. It was clear that we needed to mention, you know, the New and the Tijuana rivers and the pollution problems at the border, in particular because we want to make the case that we need more federal funding to help address those problems, and it was important to include that in the portfolio. And as for the upper watersheds, I got hammered after the draft came out by the forest interests, the forest health interests. Were like, where are we? You know, you did not include us to the degree that you should. You've got to make that forest water quality and water quantity connection. And so I sheepishly added several more actions that emphasize the need to take a landscape scale approach. And I know the science right now isn't where we would want it to be for water districts to make massive investments, you know, in upper watersheds and then pin that on some kind of, you know, additional acre feet or improved water quality that they're going to be able to point to from those investments. But you're starting to see more and more water districts like the Placer County Water Agency realize, look, you know, if I don't help take care of those forested watersheds where the water comes from that runs into my reservoirs, not only can I lose my pumping plants and my canals, you know, and my facilities, I'm going to have tens of millions of dollars worth of sediment and ash and debris to deal with. So I was, I think, justly criticized for not including enough on the watersheds in the first draft.
Terrific insight. Great. We've got a question on the Salton Sea, which of course you also alluded to as part of the plan, state's commitment. Could you provide some more detail on restoration efforts and state accountability for the Salton Sea?
I'm not the person at the Natural Resources Agency who's been working day to day on the Salton Sea, so I don't want to venture too far in terms of talking about projects. But I know that we are working on projects for dust suppression, trying to get federal resources there as well. And I mean, Arturo Delgado, who's heading up that effort for us, is out there talking to stakeholders and the public all the time. If anybody's got any questions, or concerns about accountability or transparency, just email me, nancy.vogel@resources.ca.gov, and we'll get answers to you. The website for the Resources Agency has some background on the Salton Sea projects, and it will have contacts there as well. I'm sorry, I'm just not the right person to get into the details.
All right. So we know where to go for more detail. That's great. We have a question specifically about the report, about the resilience portfolio. The question states, the portfolio frames an idea with the title of a section, Moving Forward, Regional Networks, State Support. What story can you tell us about this title?
Oh, that's a great question. That is a credit to Secretary Crowfoot, who's my boss at the Natural Resources Agency. And from the beginning of the development of the portfolio, and he played a very active role in it, that was his approach. His approach was, the state doesn't have all the answers. The state can't do everything. Nobody should be looking to the state to ensure that they've got reliable supplies into the future for the economy and communities and the environment. But the state has a few important roles to play in terms of supporting local governments as they do that. And that involves the grants when the money is available, the incentives that we can provide with that kind of funding, the kind of the science and analysis that I mentioned, on a watershed scale for climate. And then of course there's regulation and laws and regulation that provide those points that try to avoid that unless you absolutely have to. And I think in California, obviously 100 years after we regulated surface water, we figured out that we really did need it on groundwater, that if we left it completely to the locals with no state mandate, we were going to lose our drought savings bank in many parts of California, and that's our groundwater aquifers. So the thinking was that the portfolio should embody the recognition that locals are doing the work and raising the funds and paying for most of the delivery systems, and the state has an important role in making sure that that's done as efficiently as possible, that people are not excluded from the conversation about how that's done, that the environment is taken care of as well, and that people are making connections across their watersheds.
Excellent. We have a couple of kind of related questions about public feedback and public assistance in the plan. And basically, one of the questions states, how can we, as members of California society, best help aid these plans in the portfolio? Essentially, what can we, as residents of California, do to help implement the portfolio?
That is a great question. And back to my point that it's the locals who are managing and funding water by and large in California. Get involved with your local water district, pay attention to what they're doing, make suggestions, run for the board if you feel that you can add something. Just the fact that you're tuning in to listen to someone like me right now is terrific. That's the educational component. And then there will be times when, until we can find other mechanisms, pay-as-you-go mechanisms for funding water in California, there will continue to be, I'm assuming, general obligation bonds periodically on the ballot. And California voters have been great about passing those bonds. There's only 2 that have failed that I know of in the last couple decades. And So, continue to support those general obligation bonds. They only provide about 12% of the overall funding that goes into California Water. The locals are providing most of that, and then the feds about 3%. But it does provide a crucial difference on certain what they call fiscal orphans, like flood control and protecting the environment, and looking out for disadvantaged communities and so on. So vote. Vote for the water bonds after you've read them and you think they're a good idea.
Yeah, good advice. One of the things that you also alluded to, Nancy, was the role of the state agencies themselves in implementing the plans, and we've discussed various aspects of it throughout your talk. You mentioned the state agencies would be responsible for tracking and sharing progress on implementation. What specific tasks do California water agencies, or will California water agencies be given with respect to implementing other aspects of the portfolios?
So all 142 actions have been assigned to one or more different state agency, board, commission, you name it, and we all know who's got what. And we're all staying in touch. There are some real gnarly actions that in there that involve interagency coordination, and we're trying to tackle those first because they're going to take the longest time. In next summer, I will, fingers crossed, have put out for everybody to see a report that tracks our progress on these 142 actions in terms of implementation, and we should be able to explain where we made progress, where we failed to make progress, and hopefully why.
And there's a couple of related questions in the chat. This is a good place perhaps to pose them. Will this information, this kind of update to the public, be provided again on the web?
Yeah, it'll be on the Natural Resources Agency website. Absolutely. And then there are periodic opportunities where the secretaries for Cal EPA and Food and Ag and the Natural Resources Agency, like for example, at a conference of the Association of California Water Agencies, they will get together and they will try to update, the water world in California at the conference on where we stand in terms of portfolio implementation.
Excellent. I guess we have time for one more question. I'll go ahead and, as the director of the center, maybe just take the liberty of asking it. You had a couple of comments you made about voluntary agreements, particularly in terms of the Delta. Could you tell us a little bit about where you think that might be headed? More voluntary agreements, less regulation, more agreement among stakeholders?
Right. Well, I think maybe we were more hopeful about this time last year, but we'll see if there's a change in the federal administration that can change the dynamic. But right now, the Natural Resources Agency and Cal EPA are continuing discussions with water users on the major tributaries of the San Joaquin River and the Tuolumne and Stanislaus and McCollumne, etc., with the hope that we can come to agreement on habitat and flow actions that will meet the requirements, the legal requirements of the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan that the state board, the State Water Resources Control Board, has that difficult job of balancing beneficial uses and setting water quality standards, including for salinity in the Delta. We're going to continue those talks. No one in the administration has given up on trying to reach agreement. The feeling is that we can get more done more quickly that way, because if you turn to the water board and you say, go write your regulations and carry them out, you immediately end up in litigation, and the litigation can take a long time. If we can find voluntary agreements that have immediate actions, we may still end up in litigation, but maybe we can also get some habitat and flow work done while we're in litigation. That's the hope.
Terrific. Nancy, this has been just an outstanding afternoon, an outstanding colloquium, and we really appreciate it. And we need to stay in touch, definitely. Anyway,
Definitely.
yeah.
We need those social scientists. Oh,
Indeed.
it's
Indeed.
too late for it now, but I do need help on a couple portfolio actions. I may be in touch, Dave.
All right, do so. We'll make sure we get it to the right folks.
All right.
Nancy, again, thank you very much.
Thanks everyone
Outstanding.
for listening.
Absolutely, and thank you to our audience. And we'll be in touch with our next colloquium in probably about 6 weeks or so. Everyone have a great afternoon. Stay safe. Bye-bye.